Well, wonderful to see you today. Thank you so much, everyone who's joining us for our first installment of That Escalated Quickly in 2023. We're entering our second year of this season, which is great. You might say it escalated quickly. We didn't know we'd end up where we are now. My name is Charlotte Wilner. I'm Executive Director here at the Trust and Safety Professional Association, or TSPA. We're a nonprofit supporting the global community of people working in online trust and safety. So we work alongside trust and safety teams and individuals working in the field to think about how they develop the expertise and the skills and the relationships they need to navigate this really unique profession. In this series, That Escalated Quickly, we talk to everyday people who have built a career in this field. And as is often the case, most people at this stage didn't start out thinking, I want a career in trust and safety. A lot of folks in this field today got here maybe kind of by accident and have stayed here for a variety of reasons. And we love to talk to them to hear about their journeys, the choices they made along the way that got them to where they are today. Dali is an advisor to TSPA. Chanell is a wonderful and beloved community member of TSPA. And I thought that they would be a wonderful conversational pair to talk through, the stories of their careers. Dolly's going to be asking some questions, but I hope actually you'll both be contributing some answers. We will have, as I mentioned, some time at the end for Q&A, and we hope you'll use this as an opportunity to ask these fantastic practitioners some questions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the two of you, and I'll pop back in a little later for Q&A.
Thank you so much. I will be the interviewer, and it's really exciting for me to moderate this chat with Chanell. Before we get to you, maybe I'll just introduce myself. I am a trust and safety practitioner. I love that title at Google, where I lead a team of actually designers, researchers, and writers, building and designing the tools for content moderators. Very, very niche space within this niche profession. And I just love meeting people across different companies and different areas. And that was the case when I had the chance to meet Chanell. And just to get started, I really wanted you to share your story, your background, how you got to trust and safety. But to start with, I love this question of trying to find out one thing in your story that we can read in LinkedIn. So something that you can share that it's not findable on the web to get us started.
That's an interesting question. What do I have that's not findable on the web? I guess working in this field, I'm pretty conscious of like what I do not want to be findable on the web. But I guess, I'm very into painting, I suppose. Like this is something that I think it tends to surprise people because obviously I do a very serious job and I think I have a slightly serious persona, but I do a lot of paintings that I will share sometimes with family and friends, but that will be it. Like you would never do that anywhere else. But yeah, maybe it's very necessary as well for balancing this kind of work.
To have that sign. Amazing. Well, tell us a little bit about your career path.
Sure. So I'm definitely not somebody who, thought at an earlier point at the kind of post-university or at university point of doing this kind of job. It really didn't exist at all. And so, I know that at the time I was very keen to always be doing, it's like that kind of, what will make a big impact in the world. And so I worked in a lot of different public sector areas, I started out doing trade policy and working in China, and that was always very fun. And I think a lot of the different areas I've worked in, they've all been, they're interesting and they tended to be kind of quite big and these I guess what can be termed as these super wicked problems like climate change or conflicts and civil wars or, these kind of things. And so, and something that I tend to kind of, I put my heart and soul into, which could mean a lot of moving for a job or just something that I feel that really draws me in. In terms of getting into trust and safety, it was at a time when I was in the UK. I was working with the government in the UK, which was intended to be temporary while I was doing an MBA as well at the time. And I was thinking I'd probably go back to working for the UN and peacekeeping immediately afterwards. And then I was contacted by like Facebook at the time. And you know, it was one of those interesting moments where it's like the recruiter's talking to me as if I actually have a clue what type of job she's talking about. And I was just like, I don't understand. What has this got to do with Facebook? And then obviously, yeah, like being open to the whole world of, there's a lot of people doing like really bad things on the internet. And it's really, and I think that while I was used to kind of seeing it on some scale, like thinking about it from the offline world, like I worked with, in conflict situations where you obviously, like, you know, people posting things would really escalate very quickly. It's very interesting to obviously think about what that means on the global scale and all these other problems that are outside of that like remit that I was like focused on with my work or like what I was experiencing in my life. And so, yeah.
Okay. But just what did you study? Because you glazed over that, but I think a lot of people want to know at least how some of us got here. What was your degree? And you mentioned an MBA, but what else before that?
But before that I did sociology, and I was for a long time I was thinking of maybe not the kind of typical role of a social worker that I saw, but maybe something working in that realm, like maybe with schools or maybe, you know, like something like that. And then during my university, I spent a year studying in Belgium, and I met, because of the, you know, the Brussels connection, I met a lot of people that were very into international relations. And that's something that I never really encountered before, because, I mean, in my, you know, my background and our economic situation, like I never really traveled before. I'd never left the UK before starting university. And this was like my second time on a plane at this point of studying abroad. And suddenly it was like, oh, the whole world, you know, it's a really, And then afterwards I went to do international law at a university in the UK called the School of Oriental and African Studies. So it's really cool because it's kind of everything they do is not with a kind of like European or American focus. It's really like looking at things from like everywhere outside of those regions. And which again was like, for me, it was kind of just so mind-blowing because, you know, also kind of spending most of my life living in quite a small town, you know, it's suddenly I just it was like just studying things. I remember I was studying things that, like, even at the time, my teachers were like, well, this doesn't really align to your background. And it was like, but if I don't study this, I wouldn't understand it. If I'm paying for this degree, like I need to study things I don't understand. So I did like Islamic family law and like, you know, Chinese competition law and it
all makes sense now.
The most sensible path for a career development. I'm sure that like every career advisor will be like, this is not the right way to approach a postgraduate degree. But then, so then I did that. And then at the time, when I finished, I was thinking for a while, I might want to join like a law firm. And then I remember going to interviews. And at some point, I remember the firm, and it was, you know, it was one of these like big five in the UK. And I thought that these are so amazing. And, you know, the person interviewing me was almost like, I feel like I need to save you from yourself because you would not enjoy this. But I just really wanted it because I thought that was the right thing to do. And I was just like, this is like such a ridiculous way to be rejecting someone. And actually, I mean, I would have hated it. Like, it's one of those things that I think everything I was saying that I'm interested in and I want from life, it was like, it's not going to be in this job. Yeah, exactly. But at the time, I remember just thinking like, you know, my life is over and this is devastating. Everyone else around me was getting all of these great jobs and I didn't know what I wanted to do still, but the jobs I was going for that I thought would be a good match weren't. And so then I went to China and started teaching, and then I got the job working with a chamber of commerce there with the EU. And so then, it just kind of went from there. It's all very accidental, I think. It's been an accidental.
But no, when you're speaking, obviously it just makes so much sense on what you're focusing on now. And I'm sure that you draw from that for your everyday. But before we go into, so there are two things before we go into your current role that I want to talk about. You mentioned, again, you kind of breezed through things, and I'm like, oh, I want to have a 1 hour conversation just about that one thing. But you mentioned working for the UN and sort of on the more like physical safety space, which I think is an interesting translation to what you do. And then if you can tell us a little bit in passing, I know it's your past role, but what were you doing for Meta and how it kind of brings you to where you are now? And then we can dive into your current role.
Sure. So my role with Meta was working on, in particular on content like escalations and content issues where there's not an easy like policy answer to the question, where it doesn't kind of fit the boxes of like maybe how the company was used to seeing risk and assessing risk, and maybe because of there might be a local nuance to it, or it might just be something that you're looking at. And of course, after events, it makes sense. But at the time, it's kind of, well, yeah, where does this fit? And where there'll probably be a high risk associated with either leaving things up or removing things. And obviously, that's a big part of the challenges with the role, is like on the one hand, there are always these challenges of like that, this is lots of terrible content and we want to take more of it down, and we're just finding ways to identify it and take that down. But on the other hand, you have all of this content where before you kind of see the terrible impacts of it, before it's moved into that kind of certainty bucket, it's just still like, where does this fit in? Is it actually more beneficial for people to have this up, or is it more beneficial to be removing? And I was working a lot on those kind of, that kind of area.
We call them gray cases, gray area cases.
Yeah.
Is that something you call them as well? Okay. Yeah, that's another good name for a series, gray cases. Gray area cases. Okay, that's really cool. And for the UN, what was your role there?
So my role, it was different in different places. So I worked in, like my first role there was working with like a public information division, and that was in Congo, based in Kinshasa, which was like, the UN would have a radio station, and it was kind of, a lot of it would also be like, I guess it's kind of in development speak, you'll probably call it communications for development, but it's, when you're kind of doing a lot of these like big pushes, which could relate to like, please put down your weapons and join this disarmament program, or, kind of, make use of this water and sanitation program or whatever. Like it's, there's a lot of different ways that kind of communications influence like behavior change and things. So my first role was working with a team there, and I was working to the assistant of like somebody who was very incredible as well. So that was great, and I really learned a lot there. And then I think because of kind of so much work of the learnings there, I then went into work in the political affairs team. So I was working on my first posting with like political affairs like team was in Liberia, which was interesting. It was like at around the time of an election, like it was like in that kind of still post-conflict period where it's, everything's tense, but it's kind of fine, but there's still a lot of tension happening. And then after that, I went to work with the EU for a while back in Europe. And then when I went back, it was working on the Ebola crisis, but thinking more of that kind of political dimension of the crisis, because it's one of those things that, of course, makes a lot of sense to people working in trust and safety. But it's like every time there's anything destabilizing happens, you have all of these different effects, and it just, like the way that societies react are not always easy to predict as well. And I was working on that area, and then I was working on peace negotiations, specifically in South Sudan. So different things. Yeah.
What a portfolio and what a breadth of knowledge that you bring to the space. So tell us a little bit, I know some people might be super familiar with the company you work on, but for the rest of people, tell us a little bit about the company and then how you got to it and your current role.
Sure. So it's a very different type of organization and space than where I've been before. So this is it's a social marketplace, is kind of what it's termed at, but primarily with fashion resale. So like just a lot of creative people that are like, reworking like their clothes or just kind of doing clear outs with like a majority kind of young user base as well.
Okay.
And this is a company that is it's called Depop, and it's probably about like 30 million users. So again, like, you know, it's much smaller than the organizations I was working with before. Like we have about a staff of about 400 people. So yeah,
Total.
Obviously that means a trust and safety team that's significantly smaller than Google's. And so
and Facebook, I imagine. Meta, yeah.
And so so I'm working in the trust and safety team, but specifically with a focus at the moment on what we kind of see as more like user safety, community safety, and that's like it's probably more those like social interactions and the things that go wrong on the internet that's not specifically kind of, you know, related to buying and selling. So
okay,
because
what is your title?
So senior manager for community safety.
Community safety manager. That makes sense. And what is and sorry, I cut you off. Please continue. But what will be a day in the life? Because I think sometimes like we understand the space and we sort of like connect it to the title, but then what do you actually do?
It changes every day, and typically you don't start out doing what you would expect to do. But I think in this space, with my role at the moment, it's much less of the kind of escalations type things I was doing before, and much more of the like, how can we make improvements? How can we be building something new or approaching this problem in a way that might work better for where the company is now? It's quite a small company but it does have like a sizable number of users, but a lot of those users came like during the COVID period, and like the kind of company's user base like really exploded then. And I joined at a time of when after they will kind of just really think, you know, building out this kind of like specialist trust and safety capabilities, and really because that was, you know, the company was scaling at such a rapid point. And so with a lot of what we do is really about like thinking of like, where is it with where the company is now, like what would make the most sense? Would it make the most sense to be able to approach this in a way that it was done before when the user base was much smaller, or do we need to think about another way? Yeah, and it makes the job very interesting, because at the same time, it's not that we can necessarily do everything that like large platforms are doing, because of course you're talking about a much smaller team, much smaller company. Yeah, like it's obviously much smaller like budgets too, of course, and things like that. But it's still like, well, we still have like this problem, like how can we solve this in a way that works for like more of a medium-sized company with this type of user base as well.
And when you mentioned the community element, it's fascinating. Sometimes, I forget that community means so many different things. What is an example of community in a platform where people mostly sell clothes?
Yeah, there is like, I mean, I definitely underestimated how much interaction can happen when people really approach it in terms of like, this is not just about the item I'm buying, that I want this is an element of who I'm buying it from. And like also like the kind of forming of like, you know, networks and kinship between different people that might buy and sell as well, like because they share an interest in, you know, this particular type of fashion, or this particular type of reworking clothes or things like that. So it's what makes the company so interesting as well is that it really listens to kind of everyone. Like I feel like it's with every company, there's like this core set of stakeholders. Well, this is how I'm used to thinking about it, probably coming from a more political background, but you have that core set of stakeholders, and it might be like, okay, so it could be the politicians here, or it could be kind of, you know, the very senior level, like celebrities somewhere else, or, you know, that kind of thing. And here, like where I am, it's really kind of, you know, it's like, yeah, like these are people that really like care about our platform. And so
the users are a stakeholder.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah,
That's
so
really
it does
cool.
mean, it means you get a lot of opinions about everything you're doing.
That's what I was gonna say.
But
It
it's
probably
nice.
has a side
Oh,
B
yeah.
to it. It's like,
Yeah.
as a UX person, though, I really appreciate that, and I think that's how you solve problems and needs. So it's really cool. But as you were speaking about stakeholders and given your background, it's just one area that I wanted to dive a little bit deeper. And it's, you mentioned a little bit of how, obviously also you're in Europe and you're in a mid-sized, smaller company. And in trust and safety, we're dealing with a lot of regulatory sort of changes. And it's one of the areas that we need to keep an eye on. That it's difficult, especially for people just coming into this field, understanding how much of a stakeholder in our work that area is. And just, taking advantage that you have a law background, are in Europe. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper in what are some of, from the landscape, maybe to start with, what are some of the more important regulatory efforts that are happening that are influencing your work at the moment?
Okay. Well, what I can say is, well, speaking for myself, obviously not the company, but it's like the things that I keep an eye on and that I do like to follow. Like, I mean, being in the UK, the online safety bill is probably like most exciting thing that's been happening in the regulatory space for a very long time, specifically because of the way the approach of the law is really about kind of, it's not so much about the kind of, you know, companies saying, oh, yes, we have illegal content, but this is how we're following up on it.
Yeah.
It really is much more about how are you stopping this from happening in the first place, which just completely shifts that way of thinking of who's responsible. Because in this case, you know, in the former model, that's like a way of thinking about that is that it's about the bad user and everything's about like, how do we approach that bad user? And then suddenly it's kind of, like, well, you're going to get bad users. What are you doing to mitigate those impacts? And so I think it makes such a difference to our area of work, because it's like it embeds it much more in terms of into kind of, you know, the core of the company's operations. Like it's one of those things where, you know, especially thinking about it, because I come from like also having done an MBA, and it's like, it actually, it completely makes this like almost like a part of the company strategy, like its core strategy. It's not just about like, you know, policing and like the firefighting. It really is about like, how do we build safety at the heart of what we're doing? And so, I mean, the law isn't passed yet. It's, you know, it's still in Parliament, but I feel like that's something that I find very interesting.
Paying attention. Is that only in the UK or is it expanded in other countries?
So this is only in the UK. It will affect companies that are kind of making their services available to UK users. But it's one of those things, because obviously there's so much happening globally about like, you know, wanting to legislate and regulate in this space. I feel like it's one of those things that, like, you know, if it kind of works well, you're going to see other people using the same model in other places too. And so, and likewise, if it doesn't work well, there will be learnings that will probably be applied in other countries.
More widely.
And then, like with another thing that is also just very interesting to be watching is also with the Digital Services Act, because this is something that has already passed. It's going to be applicable for companies like, well, for at least for kind of, you know, the non kind of super large companies, like at the beginning of next year. And this is, again, like it's that kind of, there's such a long list of the to-dos, and like it's almost kind of saying like, you know, what it really means in terms of your to-do list to be able to say that your product is safe. And it's and with just such that a long and exhaustive list, and thinking about it from all these different aspects of what it means to have a platform, like I'm sure, you know, probably for a lot of tech execs that are going to be looking at this list, it's like stuff that they would never have even thought about. You know, it touches like even things that I wouldn't even necessarily put in terms of like the trust and safety like area at all, but it's still, it's this idea of like that level of accountability. Like if you want to have a platform and you want to attract to you, users, you need to go through this checklist and make sure that you've got everything covered.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's more at the company level, and it's interesting to think about how it affects different size companies differently. What did professionals? So you're a trust and safety person. You are hearing about all this stuff happening, and like you're saying, just because it's happening in one country doesn't mean it won't happen where you are. So it's good to pay attention. What are the opportunities and challenges for us as people working in the space?
I think that I feel like there's like a big opportunity I can see is that even though there are a lot of people that look at this kind of thinking about this from the perspective of like a lawyer or the perspective of maybe a business advisor or someone working in risk management, even, like I feel like the only people that really know what this law means for the company are going to be the people that are used to having to do the troubleshooting on all of these areas for the company. Already, exactly. So I think that it's, in some ways, I do see it as being like the, at the moment we think about this in terms of like a kind of, a niche trust and safety area. And it's like, oh yes, I work in trust and safety and this is what I do. But actually, I would imagine that in a few years, this is just going to be, I work in business strategy, or I work in, like all of these other, these are the very typical areas, because it's almost like you're going to have that kind of trust and safety lens across everything. So I feel like this is going to be a really interesting period, because at the moment, of course, we're still in the beginning. And I think that, again, like the huge opportunity and the challenges that, we're having to learn a lot. And, the goalpost keeps changing. In some ways, it's actually helpful to at least have a goalpost. I don't know, like that's probably a very UK expression, like yardstick, maybe, or
yeah. Like, no, I get it. Yeah,
like what?
And it totally helps.
I don't even really do sports, so I'm not sure why I'm using sports. But yeah, but yeah, like you have like the kind of target of it's like it's very helpful to have that target, but it does bring with all of these other challenges in terms of actually what does it really mean for us to be able to meet it versus not meet it, and what do we need to be learning to be able to do that. Like I think I've probably learned so much more in the last year in terms of thinking about what we're doing versus the regulation than at any other point, because it's kind of, it's like constantly analyzing. Like it's not just about, oh, we've managed this issue and we're good. It's like, we managed this issue, but what would this look like if the fifth regulation came?
It's almost like you have to work ahead of what you think it's coming, and people like you can probably see a little bit more of what's coming and use that information. But what does this, because I love the tension, between, I lived in California, I work for tech, and it's always like, innovation means that we can do things fast and break them, and obviously we're getting farther away from that, which is a good thing. But what does it mean for innovation to be so aware of this new stakeholder in this area? It has been a stakeholder for many other areas. I worked in aviation before, and regulation is a big thing. Transportation, there are many other areas where health, they know how to deal with it, but I think in tech it's pretty new. And for when we're thinking for people who are just starting a new product, app, platform, what does this mean to be aware of this new world?
Yeah, I think it changes a lot, right? Like I think, thinking about this from a time when I went through a pretty crazy decision period of experimenting with careers, where I thought, I'm going to start this platform that will help local communities be able to easily find more volunteer projects and things. And it's, of course, at that time, even with coming from a kind of some form of safety background, you're starting out and all you want is you want to develop your MVP, and then you just want to attract users and people to test your service and things. And even in those very, very early stages, with that kind of example, let's say it was, the town I was working with or the city I was working with, and then it's maybe there were 10 community organizations that decided they wanted to register. In that location, that's still a lot of things that can go wrong. So many things that can go wrong, but this will still be seen as being a minimum population size, probably, for just testing that your product is viable.
Right.
And then if you think like, as soon as, you're kind of in that scaling point and you're trying to show that you're attractive to investors, like no one at that point is talking about like, Series A, Series B. No one is talking about like safety.
Right.
But actually,
but can I first make a comment that I just find fascinating that you also started your own business and you had an app. That's just like amazing. Oh my God.
no, it's not. I mean, it didn't work very well, and I was very miserable.
No.
So it's not, but I tried
It's
it.
pretty
That was the
cool.
important thing.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. But sorry, continue. So no one, that's true. You go and you try to get funding and no one is saying like, did you check that a malicious person could, steal data or whatever privacy.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that soon everyone's going to have to, like, it's literally going to have to be built in, and there's going to have to be people probably on the founding team, if not the initial one, then maybe the one that's kind of, post Series A, that is actually able to think about what it means for your development in a safe way. And it's, I mean, that is going to be the cheapest way to do it. Like, the way that we're approaching it now, where, the companies kind of grow and scale, and then you just bring in trust and safety people and just tell them to go and fix it and not disturb anyone.
Right.
That's a very expensive and probably the most ineffective way to be doing it. Like, it really does become about, that kind of safety by design, but at the core of the product and at the very start of the journey. So I'd see it's an interesting time. It'll be like great to kind of, check in 5 years and see how this is all played out.
Right. Like, initially, I feel like this with all new stuff, right? But initially it's like, what does this mean for us? How is it going to take away from the ability to innovate or to come up with things? And then if you stretch it a little bit, it's like, oh, now someone with our background, our knowledge will be a startup people, and they will be part of the board right from early on. We'll make the presentations to founders and ensuring that we're careful with what we do. In UX, we're trying this method. We have design thinking, sort of a method of coming up with ideas and testing ideas. And something that we're pushing to think about is this, like you mentioned, safety by design. Just like, let's think in the same brainstorm. We have, if you do it right, 5 days of ideating, 1 day dedicated to let's think about all the stuff that could go wrong. And it's very common sense. Like, of course, we just have to think about what's vulnerable. How can people use this for a purpose that we're not actually intending to? But we don't do it enough. And this regulatory space almost feels like, well, now we have to do it. So for a lot of us that have been voicing this stuff for a long time, it's like helpful because now it's top of mind for everyone. And maybe one of the questions when you're trying to get funding will be like, show me all your unhappy paths. Like, show me all the ways that you thought about that this could be used in different ways. Sometimes it's very surprising. I remember doing research on tools for kids, like school apps, and then it'll be like, well, it was actually used for all this stuff. And I was like, of course, like we could all see it for like a mile. No one asked this question before when you guys got the funding and you were doing all the beta testing. Kids are going to be using it for this reason, right? Like for this purpose. So it just brings that conversation more front, which is an exciting thing.
I'm popping back in here because it's Q&A time. So cool. Actually, I have a question that is sort of related to the point you just made about like, oh, right, this is going to get used in ways that maybe weren't anticipated. We have a question here about how you prioritize known versus emerging risks. And I think, a classic emerging risk is one where like, it's your own product. It's me, I'm the problem, right? All of a sudden you have, an unexpected use case that you know how to account for. The question is, how do you sort of set priorities amidst all these competing risks? Do you use a scoring system, which I love the idea of like, oh yeah, it'd be great if we had a scoring system, but how do you talk about those as a teammate with your team? How do you talk about sort of those trade-offs with your leadership? What are the different approaches people want to consider when they're thinking about, wow, there's all kinds of ways this could go sideways?
Chanel, how do you
Okay.
how do you do it now?
So,
And then I can chime in also in some of our ideas.
sure. It's one of those areas where I think, like, I mean, I get very emotionally attached to issues. And this is, you know, of course, there's a level of emotional engagement that's always needed because, you know, we have to care. But I think that what it does mean is that, you know, when thinking about the fact that you can't do everything, like it always makes those decisions so incredibly hard. One thing that I've found to be like much more helpful is actually thinking about this in terms of like, this is not my priority, this is a company's priority. And actually really ensuring that it's the right people in the company that are making those trade-offs, because it is so much responsibility when, you know, when you're looking at like everything that could possibly go wrong and you only have a part of like, I don't know, like, yeah, whatever, and a few people, and thinking about,
it's never enough people, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's like,
yeah.
And it's also there's times where I'm just like, you know, I'm so stressed, and if we had 5 times the team, we still wouldn't be able to do everything that all of us really want to do, because it's just, sometimes there is a lot. It's one of those areas that I think about with the regulations that are coming, actually, because I'm like, if you're having a regulation that's listing all of these risks, which the vet is kind of in that more like known risk area, and they know that risk because, you know, this is stuff that maybe newspapers are talking about with big companies, and like with only with like certain types of services. What does it mean for companies that have different types of services where there could be like much bigger risks, but it's not in that list of things that are being regulated? Does that mean that they really have to be moving all their attention to kind of those regulated areas and kind of ignoring the things that their users are like screaming about? And actually, yeah, like it's I feel like that's going to kind of, the regulation is, you know, it's going to be an interesting to see how that dynamic works. But yeah, I guess like my answer to the question is like, it's really hard. And I think, yeah, like, you know, tried a few different things, and like, you know, things like scoring and stuff like that, but it still always requires some form of trade-off kind of level of decision making, which is always like a difficult thing to be doing in this space.
It's hard. Yeah, and I think obviously I had a little bit time to think as you were speaking. I'll just echo what you said, but there are 2 things that I see from my work, and I think what you were saying too. One, bringing the right stakeholders to make a decision. You're not making the decision alone. You don't have all the knowledge. Who are the people that you need to include? Sometimes it's the users. So a big stakeholder, but now our partner from legal, our partners from business, our partners from PR and marketing, and kind of everyone chiming in. And I think the second part is having a really good understanding of what are the metrics that you want to drive with the decision. And as you mentioned, it's a trade-off. So knowing really well that this will have an impact in user numbers, revenue, trust in our platform, or legal fees. You know, what is the thing that we want to optimize for? And again, having the conversation aligning really clearly with your stakeholders. But the last thing I will say, and I think that goes back to your part that you were saying, this is really hard. And I come from a research background, so maybe that's why, but sort of keep track of your decisions. So because you will be back at something similar next time, look back, what worked, what didn't work, were we right, were those the right metrics, are these the right people to be in the table, do we need to include other people? So next time you can improve, because we're almost like experimenting every time we get an opportunity to make these trade-offs.
Great. These are such great answers. And I'm like, oh no, we've only asked 1 question so far. So I have time for 1 more question I'm going to ask you. Which is actually just like about your experience. And that's how it is moving from different size companies. So Chanell, as an example, you went from a larger company to a smaller company. I know that was a journey that I had as well in my career. You know, what was sort of like the best part and the hardest part of that? And what would you sort of tell people in terms of reflecting on their own possible choices?
Sure. And I think that, I mean, for me, it's like the best part and the hardest part probably come down to the same thing, which is that it's, you know, the reason why I was really excited about moving to a smaller company was like, oh, I get to do and work on everything across this whole, you know, that kind of whole kind of trust and safety ecosystem. And you have it's like, as opposed to kind of, you know, just having this one specialist area and like, you know, maybe getting really good or getting a lot of focus on this, but actually not really having so much visibility on what it means across all of these like other specialist areas that hundreds of people are working on. And that is what made it very exciting. I feel like I have to be learning with what I'm doing, otherwise I get quite bored. And so, you know, it's always learning because you're still managing everything, but just with much less people. And you're getting to do like kind of everything as well. And then the hardest part is you have to do everything. And so, yeah, and you really can't just, you know, you might, even when there's times where I just like, oh, this little one thing is like super interesting and I'd love to really get into that. It's like, you can't really ignore all these other areas that also need attention. And even if it's not really like the thing I enjoyed the most, or it's a natural fit for my skill set, we just have to find someone that can do it. And if that's you, then, you know, we just have to find a way to get it done. And so, yeah, it's one of those things where when I'm having those kind of like moments of like, oh, you know, did I make the right decision and all that kind of stuff, it's like, you know, I have to remember that this is why I was here. This is why I came here. And it does make it, I don't know, like I feel like in some ways it requires a lot more energy, but then at the same time, I am noticing that I also, you know, like my well-being kind of practices I really have to kind of start taking that seriously and thinking about resilience, because it's like this, as I said, like there could be too many problems for the people available always, but it's easier when you're sharing that with like 1,000 other people versus like enough people that can fit around a meeting table. So yeah.
Great. Well, we unbelievably are at time. This went so fast. Thank you so much, Chanell, for answering all these questions. Thank you, Dali, for asking them and answering them too, actually. It was just, it was funny. We were chatting on the back end, the TSPA team, and people were saying, oh, Chanell's background is so interesting. And I thought they meant the Zoom background. I was like, yeah, the angles look great. Everything looks, right. But like, this was just a great, it was a great session. And I'm so glad that you both were available and so generous with your time and your expertise. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. Thank you if you're catching up on this recording later. It's wonderful to have you with us. If you've been watching this and you're thinking like, wow, I have so many more questions and I really want to be involved, like come check us out. We're at TSPA.org. We have all kinds of resources for people interested in trust and safety careers. We have a volunteer written curriculum with the trust and safety curriculum. We have a monthly newsletter, a jobs board. We have trust and safety coffee hours now, where we have around 50 hosts actually who are trust and safety professionals themselves, and they're ready to give you advice and guidance on career questions. That's all accessible without becoming a member of TSPA, but you should become a member of TSPA if you are a trust and safety professional. We have a members only Slack space. We run all kinds of members only events, both in person and virtual. You could be a guest on That Escalated Quickly. What more inducement do you need? So there are ways to join. If you go to our website, tspa.org, you can find out how to become an independent member, how to get your company to support TSPA, which we love and appreciate. We do have a big year ahead entering 2023, so be sure you're subscribed to our newsletter. Be sure you're checking our event hub, which is at tspa.org/explore/events. We will be announcing information on our annual conference, TrustCon, in early February, so save the date in your heart. We're doing it in July. We're doing it in San Francisco this year, and full details are going to be available real soon, so I hope we'll see a lot of you there. In the meantime, thank you.